My name is Michael Wood. Since the age of 17, I've been willing to die in service to my community. In the U.S. Marine Corps, I was Sergeant Wood.
Michael Wood spent 11 years in the Baltimore Police Department.
Michael Wood is a very honest individual. He was not liked by the Baltimore City Police because he didn't play the good old boy network game.
As my career developed, I set out to understand why people offend, instead of how they offend.
The reason why these consent decrees don't do anything is because there's no enforcement or changing of the mechanism of incentives for the officers. So all you're doing is talking about it.
I certainly was going to cross. I was ready to shoot if I had to, but I was never going to cross that line.
But you kind of wanted to shoot.
Sure. Get what you inspect, not what you expect.
So, or anywhere that's populated, is your metric is based off of arrest. So you don't actually go out and engage with the community, because that would be time that you could be getting the arrest that you're expected to get to prove that you're a decent officer. So you actually don't have any incentive to communicate.
Michael, we should be looking for goals to not have people end up in the criminal justice system. Instead, every solution we have is to push them into the criminal justice system.
It should not be up to Jeff Sessions to determine how Baltimore Police Department operates. It should be up to the residents of Baltimore. Jeff Sessions doesn't know anything about policing, never has and never will.
I want to read a quote that you gave the Washington Post, which struck me. You said, "When you work in policing, you're inundated early on with the us versus them mentality. It's ingrained in you that this is a war, and if someone isn't wearing a uniform, they're the enemy. It just becomes part of who you are, of how you do your job."
What I'm trying to say is that we are looking at people who are doing nothing new, and if we focus on the actions, then we can fix the things for next time. Because when you focus on people, we end up thinking we can chop the head off, they put a new person in and something will change. But if we don't focus on the methodologies and the institutions, then we will be
put them in a prison cell, do the paperwork, go back out and do it again. So what we really need is to change the incentives and disincentives so that no matter what the role, we're still going towards that objective that actually serves.
More occupation, more vehicles, if your answer continues to be violent, because we have to understand that everything about policing is inherently violent. I have come in there with authority and told you what you will do.
All right, go ahead.
All right, so welcome to Nuance. I am Michael Wood Jr., police management scholar, and with me is
Roberto Alejandro, editor-in-chief of Stamp.News.
Because the best part of this show, Nuance, is our awkward introductions that we always do. But one day, we are going to nail it down and have a professional introduction. I know it.
One day.
So I guess we should also say that Nuance, what is our even podcast about? So I guess that we're often just nerds who end up getting caught up in arguing the details and nuances of things naturally. So we decided to bring that to a bigger platform. But what I have found interesting that I think we needed to comment on was how similar aligned we are in our outcome desires, in our environments, and yet there are things that come up where we're like diametrically opposed.
That's very true. We've definitely had some heated debates, and then there are other times where we're just going like, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. And those aren't very interesting episodes.
No, I guess nobody really watched those episodes, but at least we can show that we're not sitting here agreeing with one another the whole time.
Yeah, that's fair.
So let's get into, what was the guy's name? Dinkheller, because this case blows my mind of something that I remember intimately from the police training and how it affected everybody in the class.
So I came across this article on CNN called "The Endless Death of Kyle Dinkheller." Now, I should say before I say anything else that it's a multi-part piece, and this discussion is based entirely on the first piece. So it could be that future pieces, perhaps nuance, sorry, for lack of a better term, what this first installation did. Based on the tone of this one, I don't expect that, but regardless, it should be contextualized that this is just a portion of this larger piece. But basically, Kyle Dinkheller was a Georgia sheriff's deputy who pulled over a driver in 1998, and after a 3-minute encounter in which the driver refuse repeated commands from Deputy Dinkheller, eventually brandishing a rifle and engaging in a shootout and eventually killing Deputy Dinkheller. The article basically says that this video has been used to train officers throughout the country, with the message basically being, don't wait and hesitate in the way Deputy Kyle Dinkheller did, because for about 3 minutes he refused to fire on this individual that he had pulled over. The individual, I should say, because it's relevant to this discussion, was a white individual who also, during the course of the conversations, said that he was a Vietnam veteran.
Now, looking back on this whole case retroactively now, as I armchair quarterback it after a decade in policing, I'm reading this thing and we have to like go through it step by step on what actually happened in this case, because it blew my mind thinking about all the subjects that this touches on.
All right,
but
so
if we started at the academy when they show that video to us, it is like it's all set up in the firearms training, and this is the one video that probably every cop in the country has seen, hands down. It is like the training video to set up the mentality of a police officer with that idea that there is no such thing as a routine car stop, which is something we've talked about before, in that there's absolutely such thing as a routine car stop, because 99.999% of them occur absolutely routinely without incident. So you already set a stage of a false reality. And within that false reality is that the cop should never hesitate, which puts the cop's life above that of the citizen. So we've got into that a lot in other episodes, but this is more of that weird, where we come in with good intentions trying to do some kind of implicit bias training, but because of all the biases and structural system of racism institutionalized within policing that we have and within our entire culture in America, we end up twisting the lessons of these things from what they should have been from the very beginning. This guy, when I see it right now, this is the example of what a cop should do. This is the example of like model empathy and service, when he put his life over another human being's at the absolute point where it mattered most. So it should be like, look, we don't expect you to lay your life down for another human being. Maybe we can't tell each other that, but this is the model of somebody who did do it. And then what we end up with the implicit bias training that comes in is the wrong message ends up getting absorbed. So let's look at our reality now of cops being trained where a white officer in rural Georgia, in a familiar streets with a familiar looking person who has a rifle. So if cops are trained to fear that as like this crazy thing, what does that mean when a cop sees a black man with a handgun in an unfamiliar territory? So the cop ends up being constantly hyperactive afraid, like they do when we have no shoot scenario training, where they thought they could come in and start training. They did it in Baltimore, done all over the country, where you think you can start training scenarios and say, hey, look, we're due training where all white women will have guns and all black guys will be completely innocent in this training thing. And cops will go through it and they'll go, you know what? All of this makes sense. You guys are right. White women are just as dangerous as black guys. And it's like, no, that is the exact opposite of what we're going for.
But it is true. I'm just saying, I mean, they didn't walk away being falsely...
It is true, but with the wrong perspective. You just ruined that whole train of thought for me, Roberto.
I'm sorry. I mean,
so anyway, go ahead and guide us through step by step, because it is critical of everything that goes in here is like encapsulating a lot of modern policing issues. And this is something from, I wouldn't say what year it was, but it was obviously a long time ago, at least in the 70s or 80s. And
no, this is from 98.
98. Wow. Okay, so that has saturated policing that quickly. I just thought in my head there was no way it could have saturated policing that fast.
But I mean, that's 20 years now.
Yeah, but I was out 11, 12, 13, 14 years ago, and
Wow, yeah.
every cop knew it then.
No, yeah, that's really incredible. So I mean, I have the article in front of me. It's kind of written in the part about that explains what happened during the encounter between Dinkheller and the person who killed him is sort of split up and spread throughout the piece. So it's hard for me, even having the article in front of me, to remember every step by step aspect of what happened.
Sure. So let's take it as a policing thing, though.
But let me just do my best to recall some of the details for the audience. Deputy Dinkheller pulls over this gentleman who gets out of the car.
Let's stop right there, Roberto.
Okay.
So he pulls over somebody. This is something we've talked about in the past. Why do we have armed personnel doing car stops? Is something we really have to ask ourselves in what we want policing to be.
I agree 100% with you. I mean, I think you've brought this point up a lot, and the more I think about it, the more I feel like a lot of the functions we ask police to conduct or to perform need to become unarmed aspects of the job.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, this doesn't make sense to not have to not reserve weapons for incredibly highly trained and specific purposes, because what is the point of a gun? This is what makes it unique, especially a handgun. A handgun is designed for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to kill another human being. So why are we setting up state-sanctioned agents to write a parking ticket with the possibility of killing somebody? Why are we pulling over cars with the possibility of killing somebody? And when we see that from a guy who is having a gun exchange in the car, now we get what happens when he steps out.
And so the gentleman steps out and starts taunting Deputy Dinkheller, and including saying, "Shoot me, shoot me, shoot me." Dinkheller is barking commands, trying to get the person to comply. He is not complying at all. And eventually he goes back to the truck.
Right. So the first time the guy gets out, his first thing is clearly a suicide by cop type of scenario. And the whole reason this is starting is because he knows that the officer has a death stick.
Yeah, I mean,
so we're not even going past this point with an unarmed officer.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the things mentioned in the article, is that idea that this person seemed to have been trying to do exactly what you just said, commit suicide by cop. And anyway, the exchange continues. Eventually, the person goes back to the truck and retrieves a rifle. At this point, Officer Dinkheller still has not fired upon the gentleman. Eventually, Dinkheller fires, misses. The article presents a theory that he may have missed on purpose, not wanting to kill this person, because supposedly he was a sort of crack shot with a handgun. And unfortunately, a sheriff's deputy with a handgun against a Vietnam veteran with a rifle isn't a great matchup, and the person ended up killing the deputy.
That starts another argument that we get into. I'll tell you, this thing hits on so many points, it's driving me crazy. Because one of my arguments is we may have to swallow a pill that sounds really weird, that our cops and the people we trust with guns maybe have to be based off of something genetic. There is something about the ability to respond under pressure that cannot be predicted by any training methods, which we've been able to show. When we do this in the military, so like you go through levels, and you end up with these people like SEALs and Force Recon that can do all these high-speed things, and they can react under pressure, they can shoot with bullets after them. And we look at that process as like training them to do that. And just looking at this from an anecdotal level, I don't think that is true. I think what we are doing is we are doing a process that unintentionally selects out those people who don't have the genetics to flood their system with adrenaline when the shit hits the fan. So I'm a crack shot. There's zero chance I miss the shot under pressure, and there's zero chance I do a warning shot. My warning shot, because I'm a crack shot, would be a true warning shot. It would be a holy shit, he just missed me by 2 inches. So, like, this, I don't believe as a theory that even if he was a crack shot, when we are under pressure, we think human beings can react that way. And we talked about this with Betty Shelby. Certain people are not cut out to be in this situation, and we're putting them in this situation because of our fear.
No, I mean, I totally agree. And watching the video of the Philando Castile shooting, the one that was released after the trial that showed the dash cam footage, that video more than anything convinced me of this point, because what I see is an officer who hears gun and then sees hands moving and just freaks out. And he's not waiting to find out, you know, is he just reaching for his wallet? You know, he just shoots first, asks questions later. And
you know,
and you
like
see that
Betty
on the
Shelby, sorry.
No, but you see that on the other video where, you know, the officer's like kind of screaming frantically as Miss Reynolds is filming.
That's exactly what I was about to say. Yeah, Betty Shelby's was the same thing. Like, and part of the reason why Dinkheller video is so powerful when you're watching it from a young officer's perspective is that fear in his voice is gripping. It's overwhelming his body. So maybe that is a natural reaction for people to look at that and go, wow, like, that fear is overwhelming his body. I need to make sure I train myself and put up all these walls so I'm not in that situation. But I'm not 100% positive that there's any walls that can be built up to prevent you from being in that situation.
No, I mean, and especially like you said, when we're sending somebody with a weapon to handle what could otherwise be sort of routine matters. You know, and I think the fact that, you know, you've raised the sort of meter maid idea. We don't require meter readers to wear handguns, even though we know they can get into confrontations from time to time when people find them putting tickets on their car, and yet we don't feel the need to arm them. And there are a lot of functions that police play, and especially, you know, some of the stories you've told where, you know, somebody called you because their kid didn't want to go to school that morning and you were there to convince them otherwise. Or, I mean, why would you call someone who's carrying a gun to get your kid on the bus in the morning, right? All of these are functions where the person responding should not be armed.
And is incredibly untrained to do those things, like with Dinkheller, the shooting. The suspect is clearly having a mental episode from PTSD symptoms that are well documented. And it's like this vicious circle of how we send people off to do the same thing off into the other countries, which we've talked about before. And then we bring them home untreated. And then we send Dinkheller out there and other officers to kind of deal with these situations. And then their answer is violence. That's what we've decided as a society, is we will handle mental health issues like this with violence. And mental health issue, we create it with our tax dollars, so we're going to solve it with our tax dollars of violence, and then cause PTSD and more trauma to the cops and to their family members and to society as well. It's this gross circle that just keeps coming up in policing.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think the point about PTSD also, and I'm just going to mention, there's an interview with an artist, Jack Hallows, on stayup.news, who's also a Marine veteran from both Iraq and Afghanistan. And we talk a fair bit about PTSD, the military's response, you know, the issues with respect to treatment, for anyone who might be interested in a little more background on that.
Yeah, awesome. Great. And that's what we're doing at Veteran Stand now. We've had to take our project that way because of all the post-traumatic stress we've seen in the veterans when we responded up to Standing Rock. Like, that's what we have to do. We have a tremendous issue with that, and we're still kind of making more and more of them every day as we continue our stuff overseas. But that's a sidetrack. So I would like to hear the rest of the Dinkheller shooting and how you perceived it.
Well, I mean, at this point, you know, eventually they're in a shootout. One guy has a rifle, the other guy has a handgun, the guy with the rifle wins. And there were a number of things that have struck me, and my thoughts have been sort of a progression. You know, my initial reaction, especially because of the way the piece was written, it felt like a justification for police officers shooting, in many instances, unarmed black men on the basis of this weird encounter where most people reading the details would have said there's any number of points here where it would have been justified to use force. And Deputy Dinkheller simply did not. And he was encountering a white person, right? So not there isn't an implicit bias aspect here in this story. And so you're trying to justify something that's clearly just a function of the racism built into our society on the basis of this strange encounter where none of the details have any bearing on the question of police shootings of unarmed black officers. And so that was my initial.
Have to do with Philando Castile being shot. What?
No, and so that was my initial reaction. And you know, a fair portion of the piece is devoted to Dinkheller's father, who's become kind of a make sure you get yourself home at the end of your shift advocate, who talks to police officers and shows them the video and sort of tries to drive home this message, you know, don't let happen to you what happened to my son. And I understand his perspective as a grieving father. And, you know, I don't pretend to understand even remotely the grief he has suffered and continues to suffer. But I can understand why he would want to become an advocate for that message, having lost his son. But, you know, as you mentioned offline, the other aspect of that is that his son displayed exactly the kind of heroism we seem to be demanding from our police officers when we say we don't want you to shoot first, right? He was willing to put his own life on the line for the sake of not killing another human being. And he waited clearly too long in this instance. But
that was his fear, right? His fear was that he was unwilling to take the steps of taking another human life.
Yeah, which is in no small part what we're, the message of Black Lives Matter is in part, if human life is so valuable, then you can't just shoot us all the time, right? And they're challenging this claim that we have in Western society, that is, human life is valuable, because our practices don't always mirror that supposed value. But here, Dinkheller seems to have, whether it was intentional or not, very much upheld that value, even sacrificing his own life for the sake of not having to violate the sanctity of life by taking another one. And so I can understand at the same time why an officer, having seen a video like this or even heard stories like this, who just wants to get home at the end of his shift and see his family, probably feels like, look, I'm going to shoot first, ask questions later, and it come what consequences, I'd rather be alive at the end of the shift. And, you know, I had a friend in Sandtown who lost a friend to violence, and he was upset because he had heard that there was a police call, that there was a suspect in the alley possibly carrying a gun, and that nobody followed that suspect. But he also admitted, look, if I'm a police officer and I hear somebody's in the alley with a gun, I'm not going in there. And so I think few of us are willing to make that sacrifice ourselves. And so we have to ask, you know, if we are going to continue to have police be armed in everything they do, if we're going to continue to ask police to do the things that we currently ask them to do, are we prepared to accept this sort of inherent human failing where they're not generally going to be willing to sacrifice their own lives for the sake of somebody else's?
And that's kind of a bigger, interesting point, because my ultimate theory is that we can't go forward in a system that the best it can do is mitigate those harms, that we have to restart and we have to build something that isn't directed to create those harms. But in real decision of societies, regardless of how much I can make that argument in scholarship, it doesn't matter if people don't want it. And a lot of that is what is happening in any of these cases. So when we see the police do this, we have to, police are, everything they do is the language of our community. Yeah. And that goes to the police. It's not the other way around. Policing is the codification and practice of what we really want to happen when it comes down to it ultimately. Like, we haven't thought through what that is. And his father is an example of this, which we've talked about before plenty of times, in that it's okay that he feels vengeance and wants to have revenge on the guy who did it. That's understandable. You are a victim in this case. But what our society has done is codify that revenge and equality into our system of justice. We have defined justice as equaling revenge plus equality, which is essentially eye for an eye in some kind of sophisticated manner of looking at it. So we heard that in the court case, that attitude comes over to the prosecutors, who pleaded with the jury to make sure that the death sentence was given to the suspect in this case, or we don't have to say the suspect, the perpetrator in this case, and that he would be killed, which was what he wanted anyway, and accepted that because it was a suicide mission to begin with. But that's what I'm saying, is our whole system is now saying that we have justice as long as we are equally brutal to everyone. And that is an incredibly dangerous concept that we have now become comfortable with.